In today's lecture, we're going to consider the work of some early Christian apologists. Specifically, we're going to look at the works of Justin Martyr and Athenagoras. The reason I want to do this is to demonstrate the importance of apologetics in the Christian faith from the very beginning. So these are both 2nd century Christian apologists. And it was in the 2nd century that Christian apologetics really was born. So you'll see that there are literally 8 or 9 Christian apologies, defenses of the faith, written in the 2nd century, usually written to the emperor, whoever the emperor was at the time. So we'll talk a little about that as we get into the lecture. And you could in many ways look at the New Testament itself as written as an apology for Christianity, not specifically written to argue against the persecution of Christians by authorities, but many see in the book of Acts Luke's apologetic concerns with trying to get the government to take it easy on the Christians. So it could be that Luke was writing at a time when he was already seeing the state itself, the Roman state, coming down on Christians. And so when he wrote Acts, one of the things he was careful to do is show that the Christians had no beef with the Roman Empire, that they weren't trying to attack the Roman Empire, that instead that their trouble really came from their Jewish roots and not because of the Romans. And so typically the Roman leaders that you see in the book of Acts are painted in a pretty favorable picture. Anyway, whether or not you buy that about Acts, there's no doubt that by the 2nd century there was basically a cottage industry in apologetics because there was so much persecution. I'll talk more about that in just a second. I should mention that your book review of the 3 views on creation and evolution, the first draft of that is due at the end of this week. So just want to very quickly go over what I'd like it to look like. Now this is what the final version will look like. Your first draft need not have all of this information on it, but this is how it should be generally structured. It would be roughly 4 pages. It can be a little longer than that if you want. And of course you're going to have a heading, Review of 3 Views on Creation and Evolution by Howard the Duck. Don't put Howard the Duck, put your name unless your name is Howard the Duck. Then you're going to do a paragraph that's only 2 or 3 sentences long that simply explains the purpose of the book. Then you're going to spend 3/4 of a page summarizing Nelson and Reynolds' argument from chapter 1. No value judgments yet. And you'll see that I've got this pretty much on the first 3 pages. No value judgments yet. What I mean by that is I don't want your opinion of how good their arguments were. Not there. You're going to have a chance to do that in the paper, but not to do that as you are summarizing their arguments. So this is important. You need to be able to synthesize the material and show that you understand what the arguments are, even if you disagree with them. Okay, so this is important. So pages 2 and 3 are going to be summaries of Newman's and then Van Til's arguments without value judgments. You want to make sure also to briefly summarize the responses by the other authors, because this is a 3 views book. That means that there are 3 authors, and each time you have one author who writes a chapter, they'll also provide opportunities for the other 2 to respond. So you make sure you'll briefly summarize that. Don't go into great detail. This is a pretty short book review. It's in page 4 that you begin to offer your value judgments. So you want to offer half a page where you name the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. And if you can't find any weaknesses to your preferred argument, then you haven't thought hard enough. Make sure that on the remainder of the page you offer your opinion of the book and the arguments that you found most persuasive. The last half of page 4 is your chance to offer your judgment, so please do. This is where you evaluate. I do want to know what you think, but I want to make sure before I know what you think that you're able to adequately digest the information in the book. So I summarize it this way. The first 3.5 pages should be written from a third-person point of view. In other words, if the personal pronoun I appears in the first 3.5 pages, you probably need to reword the sentence. No, I think this, I don't like this, I don't like that, for the first 3.5 pages. That last bit is where you're going to offer your own opinion. Okay, so that's what we want to see. The first draft is due at the end of this week. Now, let's talk about Justin Martyr for a moment. He was born in Flavia, Neapolis, which is actually in Samaria. So remember that in Jesus' day, the nation of Israel would have been divided into Judah in the south, Samaria in the middle, and Galilee in the north. And of course, Jesus was from Galilee in the north. Samaria was in between. That's where Justin Martyr was born, into a pagan family, not into a Jewish family, not into a Samaritan family. He studied many philosophies, and so he basically made himself a student of philosophies. Stoicism, Aristotelianism, Pythagoreanism, Platonism, and he considered himself a Christian philosopher. And what I mean by that is he had determined that Christianity was the one true philosophy. So he donned his philosopher's robe as a Christian preacher and a Christian teacher. He wrote a book, or a work that we refer to as Dialogue with Trypho. And what it contains 2 characters. One is a Christian apologist, someone who is arguing for Christianity, and then he has an antagonist, and that antagonist is Trypho, who is a Jew. Now, we don't know if Trypho was literally someone that Justin Martyr was having this dialogue with, or if he represents kind of the prototypical Jewish response to Christianity. Either way, the dialogue gives this this back and forth between a Christian and a non-believing Jew, who and their arguments back and forth. That's what we see there, and he describes his conversion in that dialogue with Trypho. Does philosophy then make happiness? Said he, interrupting. Assuredly, I said, and it alone. What then is philosophy, and what is happiness? Pray tell me, unless something hinders you from saying. Now, obviously, this is some antiquated English, but hopefully it makes sense. Philosophy, then, I said, is the knowledge of that which really exists and a clear perception of the truth. And happiness is the reward of such knowledge and wisdom. So see, that's not an unchristian definition of philosophy. So he says, there existed long before this time certain men more ancient than all those who were esteemed philosophers, both righteous and beloved by God, who spoke by the divine Spirit and foretold events which would take place and which are now taking place. They are called prophets. So you see, he's basically setting up the Old Testament writers and prophets as predating the great philosophers of the Greek and Roman world. He says, these alone both saw and announced the truth to men, neither reverencing nor fearing any man, not influenced by desire for glory, but speaking these things alone, which they saw and which they heard, being filled with the Holy Spirit. So this is his Christian explanation of where the Old Testament came from. He says, their writings are still extant, they're still around, and he who has read them is very much helped in his knowledge. And those events which have happened and those which are happening compel you to assent to the utterances made by them. In other words, you can see that all this has taken place, or has taken place, or is taking place. And they were entitled to credit on account of the miracles which performed, since they both glorified the Creator, the God and the Father of all things, and proclaimed His Son, the Christ. So he says the prophets were confirmed by the truth of their message, but also by the miracles they performed. And you see this up even until Christ himself. So that's what he says about in Dialogue with Trypho. It's in his apology, though, that we're going to read for the next few minutes, for the next 5 minutes or so. One more thing to note. After he was converted to Christianity, he opened a private school in Rome, and that's where he composed his apology, written to Antonius Pius, who was the Roman emperor from 138 to 161. So let's just make sure you see kind of the time scale here. The names that you're most familiar with, I have on the left-hand side here a list of all the emperors of Rome, and on the right I've zoomed in here on the time period we're interested in. he writes to Antoninus Pius, who is just before Marcus Aurelius and just after Hadrian. Now, Hadrian's famous for that wall that he built in what we now call the UK that basically separates England from Scotland. Now, it doesn't completely do that, but anyway, they're in the northern part of England, southern part of Scotland. Domitian was a great persecutor of Christians. And Marcus Aurelius, there was a great persecution during his day as well. But it's obvious that pretty much all throughout the 2nd century there was some form of persecution going on, at least in some places. So what Justin does is write to the emperor, Antoninus Pius, to argue that this should not be happening. His apology can be divided into 3 sections. First of all, he argues that Christians are innocent of crimes. Second, that Christianity teaches the truth. And third, demons are responsible for religious myths. So what you see here is a man writing to the emperor to say, please leave us alone. Please stop persecuting us. Now, I have several pages of text. We won't go through all of it. I will provide that in the PDF, but I just want you to see the way that Justin Martyr defended the Christian faith. He says, why then should this be when he's talking about persecution? In our case, who pledge ourselves to do no wickedness, nor to hold these atheistic opinions. They were accused of being atheists. I'll come back to that. You do not examine the charges made against us, but yielding to unreasoning passion, to the instigation of evil demons, you punish us without consideration or judgment. So you see here 2 things going on. First of all, he's saying the Romans brag about their law and being a people of law, but that's not what's happening here. The Romans claim to be reasonable people, but that's not what's happening here. And why is that? Well, because demons are at work. And so there are people who falsely accuse us of all kinds of things. So you can read his argument there, but I want to move on just to let you see, first of all, the mention of the charge of atheistic opinions. And he says, look, we pledge ourselves not to do any wicked things, so why in the world would the law come after us when we're not doing anything wrong? We're not doing anything illegal. In chapter 6, that was from chapter 5, in chapter 6, you see that he talks about the folly of idol worship. And you'll see this often in the 2nd century apologists. They say, look, to be a good Roman, the Romans say, you're supposed to worship the gods of Rome. And many times that meant that the local gods were co-opted to be Roman gods and vice versa. But he says there's a problem with this, and you all know what it is. He says, we don't honor with many sacrifices and garlands of flowers such deities that men have formed. Of course we don't do that, because they're made by human hands. So just the same very argument that you and I would probably make against idol worship, he makes that too. How can you take something that's been carved up by a man, casted and hammered by a man, he says, and worship it? That doesn't make any sense. He said instead, and this is in chapter 13, we serve God rationally. We're sober-minded. He says, what sober-minded man will not acknowledge that we are not atheists? See, they were accused of being atheists or against the gods or not believing in the gods. And so in that sense, they didn't believe in the Roman gods. It meant, to the average Roman, that meant they weren't good Romans. They weren't patriotic. And so it's important to realize in ancient Rome, in the Roman Empire, religion wasn't so much about your personal relationship with God as it was showing yourself to be a good citizen. And Christians were viewed as being bad citizens because one reason was because they didn't worship the Roman gods. It's in his passage in chapter 13, though, you see some remarkable things that are mentioned. He says, our teacher of these things is Jesus Christ, who was born for this purpose and crucified under Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the time of Tiberius Caesar. By the way, that's exactly what the Bible teaches. All those things. And he says we reasonably worship him instead of like an idol, because he's the Son of the true God himself, and holding in him the second place in the prophetic spirit, the third we will prove. So basically you have the early form of argument for the Trinity here, not the way we would say it necessarily. God the Father, the first, Jesus the second, the Son the second, and the Spirit the third. But you see here that argument being made. In the next video we'll pick up here.